try to get through this fairly quickly. I really want to focus on one aspect of the problem that I think goes to two issues that we really have to tackle with, wrestle with. One has to do with notions of property, and the other is notions of state sovereignty and how they limit, among other things, possibilities under what we consider environmental law. So next slide. Just to put this in context, I'll be focusing on the problem here in terms of our overall structure for the meeting. Next slide. Those of you who've seen me, it seems I can't give a presentation without putting some version of this slide up here. So just to frame the problem as I see it is that we're in a point in history right now where we're, I think, caught between this growth-insistent, globally dominant paradigm, which is not only globally dominant, but really shifts down pretty much everywhere to the local level, represented by things like the G20 meetings. If you want to just read the minutes of one of those things, you'll get the idea here very quickly. The UN, despite the nice examples that Klaus gave us, the provisions in the SDG goals, the future we want, and so on, really reflect this growth-insistent agenda, and so on. And that's in tension with this limits-insistent agenda that's very consistent with what we've already heard here today, that we need to work towards containing our social and economic life within global ecological boundaries. Together, this clash, which in many ways these are mutually exclusive narratives, open up the way for working towards a mutually enhancing human-Earth relationship. That's Thomas Berry's phrase that I find very compelling in among the many different ways we can describe this. The primacy of ecological limits in our legal and governance systems. New ways of thinking of interhuman, interspecies, and intergenerational fairness, and guaranteeing that in a more consistent way. This is the world in which ecological and economics and degrowth economics are trying to get footing in the law and policy world. And it's where ecological law and governance come from. So when I started my graduate studies, the big question I had, because I had discovered the world of ecological economics, is, well, what's to law? What ecological economics is to economics? Next slide. So another thing, because I also, in my graduate studies, got immersed in systems thinking, which I think is key to, it's a key part of what we need to think about when we shift from environmental to ecological law. And a basic principle in systems is path dependence. Where we can go in the future depends on where we've been in the past, and that limits what is now possible in the future. And that scenario is always shifting forward in time. So that line between what the past makes possible in the future is always changing. And that slide just basically frames this challenge I mentioned in another way, with where we are now in this idea of transition. So the problem, which is I'm going to focus on here. Next slide. Here's some of the core foundations of the dominant regime that law, and including environmental law, currently serves. So first, there's this strong commitment to infinite economic growth. We have strong notions of state sovereignty in most parts of the world. The European Union being an interesting exception in terms of the ability of a fairly comprehensive layer of supranational law being developed, including laws regarding the environment. Privatization and strong protection of property rights, that's a very key way in which right now we define the human-Earth relationship. More and more monetization and commodification of things, including nature, in the form of things like valuation of ecosystem services. It kind of simplifies decision-making in a way that's attractive to many people, but also just washes over many values. Capitalism and protection of corporations, who we've decided to give, and what we've decided to give legal personhood to in many of our systems is a key problem. So next slide. What emerges from this is, or what I want to focus on here, is the problem of remote ownership, which brings many of these things together. So a lot of this was inspired when I was doing my graduate work on this book I read, next slide, called The Land Grabbers, which is a fairly depressing, I've got to say, survey of land and resource grabbing around the world. But it's very compelling. It was kind of a necessary read. And a lot of land grabbing and resources grabbing raises very, very starkly this question, this problem of remote ownership. And I always want to focus on one example that's in our part of the world. Next slide. So under, well, this is the Digby Neck on the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia. About halfway along the neck is this White's Point. Well, that neck is actually a big ridge of basalt. And there was a company in New Jersey that was kind of lured up there by a member of the Nova Scotia Parliament to have them come up, mine that basalt and ship it back down to New Jersey. For economic reasons, shipping was the way to go, not trucking. And what that company did was it bought up property in little chunks that were just under the size that you would need to do an environmental assessment under Nova Scotia law. And then surprise, all of a sudden they had a 50-year plan to mine that basalt and ship it down to New Jersey for road building and other construction. Well, eventually the federal government got involved in Canada because they needed to build a marine terminal. So they set up the highest level of environmental impact assessment in Canada, a joint review panel. And at the end of that, the panel concluded that there were basically severe and unacceptable impacts on the Bay of Fundy ecosystem and on local community values. Well, at that point, the company had two options. They could appeal that decision through the Canadian court system, or they could sue Canada under Chapter 11 of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and that's what they did. So next slide. Let's see where I am here. So this is basically the summary of this case. So the panel concluded the harm to the Bay of Fundy not compatible with core community values. So the project was rejected. Under Chapter 11, the government, the company wanted $101 million in damages. And actually there was an article about this in the New York Times. With NAFTA being renegotiated, this provision is one of many things that's in contention. The U.S. actually says they want to get rid of it, make it voluntary, which is interesting that I agree with their conclusion, but maybe not their reasons. But it's actually something like $400-something million that this company wants. The panel that reviewed this by a decision of 2-to-1 found in favor of the company. So now it's just a question of doing the damages stage. So we'll have to find how much Canadians in here of our taxpayer money is going to have to go to pay this New Jersey company. Well, I guess the good news in a way here is that project was not built. The bad news is, what's the effect on our legal decision making, our governance systems, if there's a potential that we're going to have to cop up $500 million to a foreign company because we in Canada applied our environmental laws, our environmental assessment laws, in a way that required the project, a bad project, a project in the wrong place, a project that was essentially land and resource grabbing in the worst sense of the word, if it gets rejected under the applications of environmental laws. You know, this kind of this land and resource grabbing thing, I think, is there's specific context that I think really underscored in the next slide. You know, one is when it's dealing with non-renewable resources, and part of that is, I think, when we discuss ecological law, that's a really tough question to deal with, because we're already exhausting many of them, and they're not going to come back within it's going to take geological time, not human historical time for those to be recreated. So we might imagine that that's something we really have to minimize or get rid of, but still we have to think about how ecological would apply. And these are examples, so it's the next slide. There is no cycle when we talk about a circular economy. You just can't talk about it in the context of these kinds of resources. And another thing about it is that the decision on this is really driven by the price. So in Mexico, how much of the mountaintop gold mining they're going to do is driven by the price of gold. In the oil sands in Canada, whether and the extent to which that's going to be done is going to depend on the price of oil. It doesn't you know, the climate change is barely considered. You know, in many cases, land and resource grabbing is a remnant of colonialism, or a new form of colonialism, and we can see this in Canada. Sort of the legitimacy of the presence of Europeans here in other parts of the world. It's not really questioned that much. You can see this in a recent Canadian Supreme Court case in which, like, whatever happens in terms of the duty to consult with Native Americans, and when the government approves projects that affects their rights and their traditional lands and things, it's never can be a veto power. You can talk to them, you have to take it seriously, but you can never give those groups whose land was overtaken the final say. And the other thing that I think is sort of really key to think about here is that a lot of these resource and land grabbing opportunities have been converted into investment opportunities. So you can go to a bank in London, or you can go to a bank in New York, and they say, hey, have we got, you know, where we're getting really good returns, it's just farming in Africa. But, you know, and so people make their decisions on the returns. This is not, it's very rare for people at that level of abstraction from the decision making that affects local concerns through land and resource grabbing is going to take into account what's happening to real people in real places. So what's wrong with this is a way that if your assignment is to talk about the problem, you can sort of sneak in the solution. You say the problem is it doesn't do the solutions that I think are necessary. So I just want to point out, just in my work, some areas that I think can inform how we think through these things. So one is the area of ecological restoration, or as it's often considered more in Europe, ecocultural restoration, which to me is more interesting in a way, because a lot of ecological restoration in this part of the world is really about fixing up a place that doesn't have humans involved. That's a sort of a long tradition in how we do parks here, how we do protected areas. And for many parks here, we've actually kicked people out. Yellowstone Park, I mean, Native Americans lived there. They got kicked out to make that a park. But in any way, in either case, it's a process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem, or I would say a human inclusive ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. There's a key role for human choice, intention, and goal-oriented intervention. So I think this is also an important point to think about in this transition and a problem. We have to make choices collectively to not do things that we're capable of doing and that we are now already doing. So that's a key thing. And how can we apply this approach behind site-specific small-scale restoration efforts to multi-scale restoration up the global level? So the problem here that I think I'm interested in putting my imagination in, and maybe as a group we can do this, is how do we scale this idea up? The next slide, I mean, this is just a nice book by Eric Higgs called Nature by Design. And this diagram just shows how you integrate basically historical fidelity. You want to get back to a place. The way I think of it is back to a place in time and a situation where humans and their ecosystem, where there was the mutually enhancing relationship we want to achieve. And that's, if you're doing this right, you're constantly thinking about this and paying attention to it. So let me just then quickly get to 2 slides ahead. The other area that I find that really compelling is lessons from Elinor Ostrom's research on common pool research resources, and this is another area where I think that the scaling up of problem is important to think about. But she listed these 7 conditions, or I think I added when I'm looking at I know there's really an eighth, which was a strong identity with place. But these are all within the world of property. What Elinor Ostrom really offered was as a way to thinking of property that was collective, and that the exclusion here, which is often a key aspect of what we think of property, was done on a collective basis. And I guess all of these conditions just really arise from a long-standing intergenerational connection to place. And I think more or less she defines success in these in the case studies where she found success to be something that we might think of as resembling a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship. So the next slide, if you just pull this together, things that I guess I would draw as important to keep into mind, to take into mind, and to connect this to land grabbing. These are things that are applied in a place-based way that should be resistant to remote ownership. So just to underscore key points, there's this key role for human choice, intention, and intervention. To work right, these are approaches that require monitoring and adaptation. And that's another thing we have to grapple with in this kind of a talk. Law tends to want to nail down a certain amount of certainty. Adaptation kind of throws a wrench into that. But I think there's a lot of scholarship in this area that says that's really the approach we need to work towards. And these are not, these are flexible approaches in a number of ways. So what, as long as you're keeping asking the question to make reference to historical conditions that might reflect a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship, preferably in discursive ways that involve the people that are most affected, there's no clear answer to that. It comes out of a discursive process. Emphasis on embedded, resilient, and communal connections of people and place. This is something that I think it draws directly out of a broad look at ecological and ecocultural restoration and Ostrom's work. And a focus on locally tailored options and enhancing attachments to place. Keeping in mind that not every local group is going to take, is interested in taking good care of its locality. And I would say especially when they get caught up in a process that it's essentially going to lead to land and resource grabbing. That's what I have for you. Say one more slide that just
yes, please.
It says love kills capitalism. I didn't write it. I just took the picture. This was in Munich.
Question for holding to the 11 o'clock deal a few minutes ago. Anyone want to jump in with a question or comment to Geoff?
When we have international law, for example, the one that the countries agree in the UN, and then we have NAFTA, and we have like different perspectives, as you said in this case, where Canada was having issues with the United States. So if you have this environmental process where it says, well, if it's not good for the community and it's not good for the environment, then we don't have to do the development. But then the case is, we lose the case in Canada, but then what about the international law where we have to take care of the environment and follow the processes environmentally?
Well, so these laws really reflect our priorities as a society. The provisions that are in the law to protect the environment are very, very, very soft. So there's actually, within Chapter 11, there's an article that says the countries agree that they should not waive, derogate, or their laws of their environmental health and safety laws. Therefore they shouldn't do that. And if one of them does it, another country can have talks with them. So that is a very, very soft remedy. Under Chapter 11, there's been cases like this Clayton-Bilton case, I don't know, like 60. There's not been one consultation. And even in the news reports, you hear the Trump administration wants to do all these environmental rollbacks. That is clearly a violation of that provision.
Yeah.
The Harper government did it, but even it happened under the Clinton administration. Interestingly enough, when I did some research on this, I couldn't find that many examples from Mexico. So the answer is that what's hard, where the governments have waived their sovereign immunity to suit where they have to pay money or be subject to the rulings of an arbitration or a court, it's in the trade or business arena. Then they get serious. So
it's just a very short comment. I mean, it's basically the way we are building our international law, because in investment law, I mean, is falling under investment law, and in investment law you have a clear priority in the protection of investors over other interests. So it's the way it's built. I mean, the consequences we see is a consequence of how it's built. So there is not so much room. I mean, you can insert more environmental consideration, but the arbitrators very often they judge in favor of the investors because this is the law they are applying. So it's a structural problem.
Well, I just wanted to point out, maybe to end on a slightly glass half full, people are great, that in the Vilcon case, from what I understand, that was actually called a sustainability assessment with Robert Canadian scholar Robert Gibson pushed for. So that's an idea of just a simple change of terminology to begin with. Let's move away from environmental assessment towards sustainability assessment, which gives such teeth, which helps to give better teeth to that environmental assessment. So this idea of just changing wording sometimes has an impact. And also the dissent, what we like to brackets it by our Professor Don McCrae from Ottawa, University of Ottawa.
Wonderful.
And but what the point I would make is that he took the exact same legal provisions and he came to a different conclusion because he used this different lens. So I think that's also the promise of ecological law, that we should try to dismantle ridiculous provisions like Chapter 11 and all of these things for sure. But in the short term, even just our talk about ecological governance and paradigm shifting, that in that case he came to a different conclusion. And so it's this different lens that he applied, and that's what we're asking people to do with ecological law. So I think it's a short-term step that can have some impacts. So yes.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.